The ground is shaking. Not from thunder. From feet. Thousands of them. Roman feet, hammering the earth in perfect rhythm, shields locked, javelins raised, the air already thick with the iron smell of what is about to happen. Somewhere ahead, in the dust and the noise and the screaming, an army is waiting, and it does not look afraid. It looks like it has already won. The man at the center of the Roman line cannot see his flanks. Cannot see his rear. He can only feel the pressure building on every side, the formation compressing, men being pushed inward, the line folding inward like a fist closing around something it intends to crush. He screams an order. Nobody hears him. The horns are too loud. The dying are too loud. And somewhere in the chaos, a thought crosses his mind that will haunt him for the rest of his very short life. Rome should not be here. Rome was never supposed to survive this long. But Rome did survive. And what it became, what it forced itself to become through blood and failure and terrifying reinvention, would change the course of human history so completely that we are still living inside its consequences today. This is not a story about destiny. Rome was not chosen. Rome was not blessed. Rome was a city on 7 hills surrounded by enemies who wanted it gone, and it survived because it learned something that no other civilization had ever fully understood. Not just how to win, how to lose, and come back. The story begins not in glory. It begins in humiliation. In the early centuries of its existence, Rome was nothing remarkable. A collection of hilltop settlements on the western bank of the Tiber River in central Italy, surrounded by more powerful neighbors. The Etruscans to the north were sophisticated, organized, and culturally dominant. The Greek colonies to the south were wealthy and educated. The Samnites in the mountains were ferocious warriors who had spent generations learning how to kill in difficult terrain. Rome sat among all of them, smaller, rougher, and perpetually threatened. And then, in 390 BC, something happened that should have ended Rome entirely. A Celtic people the Romans called the Gauls swept down from the north, shattered a Roman army at the Battle of the Allia River in a matter of hours, marched unopposed into the city, and burned it. They occupied Rome for months. They ransomed it. They humiliated it in ways that Roman writers would struggle to describe for generations afterward without their hands shaking. When the Gauls finally left, Rome was a ruin. Its archives were ash. Its records were gone. Its pride was something that existed now only as a wound. Most cities in the ancient world did not recover from this. When a city was sacked and burned, the survivors scattered, the population dispersed, the name faded into the geological record. What made Rome different was not what happened next. It was how Rome chose to think about what had happened. The Romans rebuilt. Not slowly, not hesitantly, they rebuilt with a kind of savage urgency that disturbed even their allies. They threw up walls, expanded their army, reorganized their military structure, and began looking at the world around them with eyes that were no longer merely defensive. The Gauls had exposed a truth that Rome could not unknow: security was not something you built inside walls. Security was something you pushed outward, until your enemies were too far away, too broken, or too Roman to threaten you anymore. This was the idea that would eventually produce an empire stretching from Scotland to Mesopotamia. But first, Rome had to solve Italy. The wars Rome fought on the Italian peninsula across the 4th and 3rd centuries BC were not clean or romantic. They were grinding, multi-generational struggles against mountain peoples who knew their terrain better than any Roman general, who could disappear into valleys and reappear behind formations that had assumed they were safe. The Samnites in particular forced Rome to do something it had never been comfortable doing: change. The old Roman military formation, the phalanx, was a structure borrowed from the Greeks. Rows of men with long spears, shields locked, advancing in a block. It worked beautifully on flat ground against an enemy willing to meet it in kind. It failed catastrophically in the hills of Samnium, where the terrain broke formations apart and left soldiers exposed on broken ground with weapons designed for the wrong kind of fight. What Rome replaced it with was one of the most consequential military innovations in the ancient world: the manipular legion. Instead of a single rigid block, the Roman army was now divided into smaller, semi-independent tactical units, maniples, that could operate flexibly across broken terrain, pull back without collapsing the whole line, advance where an enemy was weak without committing the entire formation. It was a military system built not just for winning, but for surviving the unexpected. For adjusting. For continuing. Rome did not invent this idea from pure genius. It was beaten into them by people who nearly destroyed them. That is the pattern, if you look carefully enough. Almost every major Roman military innovation was a response to near-catastrophic failure. Rome did not evolve through success. Rome evolved through crisis. And no crisis would teach Rome more than what came next. His name was Hannibal Barca. He was 29 years old when he led his army out of Spain and across the Alps in 218 BC, and by the time he arrived on Italian soil, he had already done something that most professional military men of the time considered operationally impossible. He had crossed the highest mountain range in Europe in winter. With elephants. With an army of roughly 40,000 men, mercenaries from across the Mediterranean world, Iberians, Numidians, Gauls, Libyans, each fighting in their own style, each loyal not to a nation but to a general who had earned their faith through nothing but results. Rome had never faced anything like him. The first encounters were bad. At the Trebia River in December of 218 BC, Hannibal lured a Roman army into a freezing river crossing and destroyed it on the opposite bank using a combination of ambush, elite infantry, and a cavalry arm that the Romans, on that day, simply could not match. Thousands of Romans drowned or were cut down in the shallows. The survivors who made it back to Rome arrived frozen, bleeding, and unable to explain exactly what had happened because the chaos had been so complete that very few of them had seen more than their own 5 feet of nightmare. Rome sent another army. Hannibal destroyed it at Lake Trasimene in 217 BC, in an ambush so perfectly conceived that it has been studied in military academies for 2,000 years. He positioned his forces in the hills along the northern shore of the lake, hidden by morning fog, and waited while an entire Roman army marched into the defile between the hills and the water, a column stretching miles, unable to deploy, unable to form, unable to fight. When the signal came, the Carthaginians attacked from 3 sides simultaneously. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. 15,000 Romans died in the fog before they fully understood they were in an ambush. The consul commanding the army, Gaius Flaminius, died somewhere in the press, his body never recovered. And then Cannae. The summer of 216 BC. Southern Italy. A flat plain near the Aufidus River. Rome had spent a year rebuilding its forces, and now it sent them south in a formation that should have been overwhelming. Approximately 70,000 soldiers, the largest Roman army assembled to that point, facing Hannibal's force of roughly 50,000. The Romans understood they were outnumbered in cavalry. They compensated by concentrating their infantry in the center, compressing the formation to create maximum striking mass. The plan was to hit Hannibal's center so hard, so fast, that the battle would be over before the cavalry advantage on the flanks could be decisive. Hannibal saw this coming. He deliberately weakened his center, placing his least reliable Gallic and Spanish infantry there, bowing the line forward toward the Romans in a shallow convex arc. When the Roman mass struck the center, it would feel like progress, the enemy giving ground, the formation advancing, the attack working. But on the flanks, Hannibal had placed his best African infantry, disciplined veterans who had been fighting with him for years, positioned at angles so that as the Roman center pushed forward and the Gallic center bent backward, the African wings would close around the Roman flanks like a pair of hands cupping water. And on the far wings, his Numidian and Iberian cavalry were already destroying the Roman horsemen. What followed was not a battle in any sense Romans would have recognized. It was a closing. The Roman formation, so dense it had been a strength a moment ago, became a death trap. Men could not raise their sword arms. Could not turn. Could not see where the danger was coming from because the danger was coming from everywhere. The killing went on for hours. When it was over, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans lay dead on the plain at Cannae. The Carthaginian soldiers were exhausted from the work of killing. Some accounts suggest they had to stop and rest before they could finish. Rome had lost, in a single afternoon, roughly a fifth of its adult male citizen population. In any other civilization, in any other political system, at any other moment in history, Cannae would have ended the story. It did not end Rome's story. And the reason it didn't is perhaps the most psychologically extraordinary thing about Rome. The Senate met. Men who had just lost sons, brothers, nephews, entire family lines in a single afternoon sat in a chamber thick with grief and made a decision that defies almost every human instinct. They would not negotiate. They would not yield territory. They would not reduce their demands. They would continue the war on the same terms as before. One senator proposed ransoming the prisoners Hannibal had taken. The Senate voted no. They would not give Hannibal the money. They would not give him the legitimacy that negotiation implied. They would raise new armies. This was not courage in any simple sense. It was something harder to name, a collective psychological refusal to accept that this was the end, combined with a political system sophisticated enough to hold that refusal in place even when the emotional pressure to collapse was overwhelming. Rome's republican structure, for all its flaws and contradictions, had produced a ruling class that had been trained, generation after generation, to think about Rome's survival as the supreme value. Personal survival was negotiable. Rome's survival was not. Hannibal had won every battle and was losing the war. The strategy Rome adopted after Cannae was one of deliberate, infuriating patience. A dictator named Fabius Maximus had proposed it even before Cannae and been mocked for it. Now it became doctrine. Rome would not meet Hannibal in open battle. Instead, it would use its superior knowledge of Italian terrain, its network of allied cities, and its logistical depth to deny Hannibal supplies, interdict his foraging, and wear down his army through attrition and isolation. Hannibal could win every engagement and still find himself unable to feed his men by winter. Meanwhile, Rome was fighting on other fronts, sending armies to Spain to cut off Carthage's western base, fighting a simultaneous war in Macedonia, maintaining naval superiority in the western Mediterranean. The Roman system, the empire of management and logistics that the Republic had been building for a century, was proving more durable than any single military genius could overcome. By 206 BC, a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio had destroyed Carthaginian power in Spain so thoroughly that Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, who had been trying to march reinforcements across the Alps, was dead and his army scattered. Hannibal received the news of his brother's death when a Roman soldier threw Hasdrubal's severed head into his camp. He recognized his brother's face. He said nothing. He walked away. Witnesses recorded that it was the first time they had ever seen him look like a man who believed he might lose. In 202 BC, Scipio crossed into North Africa and threatened Carthage itself. Hannibal was recalled from Italy after 15 years on enemy soil, an army that had never been decisively beaten in the field, finally ordered home to defend a city he had not seen since childhood. He faced Scipio at Zama. His veterans were tired, his new recruits were untrained, his elephants panicked and ran through his own formation when Scipio's men opened lanes and let them pass harmlessly through. The Numidian cavalry that had destroyed Rome at Cannae was fighting for Scipio now, having changed allegiance. Hannibal's center broke. His army dissolved. Carthage sued for peace. Rome had survived. But surviving was not the same as becoming an empire. The transformation from republic to the dominant Mediterranean power happened not in a single moment but through a series of decisions, each made in the immediate logic of security or economic interest, that accumulated into something nobody had explicitly planned. Rome did not conquer the Mediterranean because a Senate committee voted to build an empire. Rome consumed the Mediterranean because every time it solved one security problem, the solution created a border with a new potential threat, and the only logical response was to push that border further out. After Carthage, Rome turned east. The kingdoms that had fractured out of Alexander the Great's empire, Macedonia, the Seleucid realm, Egypt, were wealthy, cultured, and deeply suspicious of each other. Rome inserted itself into their rivalries, sometimes through war, often through the more elegant mechanism of declaring protectorates, accepting the submission of kings who preferred Roman backing to annihilation by their neighbors. Within 2 generations after Zama, Rome was effectively master of the entire eastern Mediterranean without having systematically set out to become so. The wealth that flooded back into Rome from these conquests was transformative and destabilizing in equal measure. Enormous agricultural estates, worked by slaves captured in the wars, drove small Roman farmers off their land. The Republic's traditional social structure, built around the citizen soldier farmer who owned his plot and owed military service in return, began to collapse. Men who had served in distant wars returned to find their land sold or swallowed by a neighboring estate. They drifted to Rome, landless, politically volatile, available for manipulation. The century between approximately 130 BC and 30 BC is what historians call the Late Republic, and it deserves that title because during those 100 years, the Republic died. Not quickly. Not cleanly. In convulsions and bloodshed and a series of civil wars that each seemed like they might be the last, until the next one started and proved the previous one had only been prelude. Reformers were killed in the Forum. Generals marched their armies against Rome itself, something that had once been so unthinkable it had no precedent, and then became so common it stopped being shocking. Sulla marched on Rome. Marius's veterans answered. The proscription lists went up, naming citizens who could be killed on sight and whose property would be confiscated, and men walked through Roman streets in fear of neighbors who might find their name profitable. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in 49 BC with a single legion and a decision that he understood was irreversible before he made it. He had calculated that the alternative, being stripped of command and prosecuted by his enemies, was worse than the gamble. He was right, in the short term. He won the civil war, became dictator, and was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BC by men who believed they were saving the Republic. They were not saving the Republic. They were starting the last civil war. What emerged from the smoke of that final conflict was not a monarchy in any simple sense, and not a republic in any real one. It was something Rome invented almost by accident, a political system with no previous template. Augustus Caesar, the adopted son of Julius Caesar, born Gaius Octavius, a man who had been underestimated by nearly every opponent he ever faced, took the shattered pieces of a century of civil war and assembled them into a structure that looked enough like the old republic that nobody had to officially admit the republic was gone, while functioning in every meaningful way as an autocracy with one man at its center. He held no title that hadn't existed before. He called himself Princeps, first citizen. He held powers granted to him by the Senate, technically voluntarily, technically revocable. Nobody revoked them. The legions answered to him. The treasury answered to him. The provinces answered to him. And after decades of civil war, most Romans, exhausted, grieving, terrified of another round, answered to him too. Under Augustus and his successors, Rome's empire reached its administrative peak. Roads cut across Britain, across Gaul, across Spain, across the Balkans, across Anatolia and Syria and North Africa, binding territories that had no common language, religion, or culture into a single economic and political organism. Latin spread as the language of law and commerce. Roman citizenship, once a jealously guarded privilege, gradually extended outward until in 212 AD, the Emperor Caracalla granted it to virtually every free person in the empire. The borders were enforced by a professional standing army, the like of which the ancient world had never seen, career soldiers, not citizen farmers, trained, paid, and pensioned by the state, stationed in fortified positions along frontiers that stretched thousands of miles. From Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain to the Euphrates River in modern Iraq. From the Rhine and Danube rivers in Central Europe to the edge of the Sahara Desert in North Africa. One empire. One legal system. One currency. A level of economic integration that the region would not see again for nearly 2,000 years. But empires, like the men who build them, carry the seeds of their undoing inside the same qualities that made them great. The very size that made Rome powerful made it ungovernable in slow emergencies. The professional army that secured the frontiers also produced a cycle of military coups that destabilized the political center. The wealth that the empire generated created a ruling class so accustomed to luxury that the administrative capacity to manage crises gradually hollowed out from within. The frontiers pressed by Germanic peoples who were themselves being pushed westward by movements originating deep in the Asian steppe required resources that a system built for the 3rd century BC could not easily supply in the 4th century AD. The Western Roman Empire formally ended in 476 AD when a Germanic chieftain named Odoacer deposed the last emperor, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople rather than bothering to install a new Western emperor. It was not a dramatic moment. It was barely noticed at the time. The empire had already been fragmenting for generations. What 476 AD marked was not a fall so much as a formal acknowledgement of something that had already happened. The Eastern Roman Empire, based in Constantinople, continued for nearly another 1,000 years, until 1453 AD. The Roman Catholic Church, structured on Roman administrative lines, kept Latin alive as the language of European civilization through the medieval period. The legal codes that Roman jurists had developed, the Corpus Juris Civilis compiled under Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, formed the foundation of legal systems across continental Europe that are still in operation today. The very concept of a unified law applying equally to all citizens, regardless of local custom or tribal affiliation, is a Roman idea. So is the concept of the nation-state built around civic identity rather than ethnic identity. So is the idea that political authority requires at least the performance of popular consent. We live, all of us, inside a civilization that was constructed largely by people who were trying to rebuild, imitate, or react against Rome. The founders of the American Republic studied Rome obsessively, and they were as influenced by Rome's failures as by its successes. The street layouts of European cities still follow Roman plans. The calendar we use was reformed by Julius Caesar and modified under Augustus. The month of August bears his name. When Rome burned in 410 AD, sacked by the Visigoths under Alaric, the first time the city had fallen to an enemy in 800 years, Saint Augustine of Hippo sat in North Africa and wrote a book called The City of God, trying to explain why a Christian empire under God's protection could fall to barbarians. The theological and philosophical gymnastics required to answer that question produced ideas that shaped European intellectual history for 1,000 years afterward. Rome fell. But the fall itself produced thought, law, language, architecture, theology, and political theory that outlasted every empire that tried to claim Rome's inheritance. That is an achievement of a kind that no simple military victory or political triumph could have produced. It is the achievement of a civilization that was catastrophically broken, repeatedly, and chose every single time to rebuild rather than scatter. There is something in that story that is not comfortable to sit with. Because it means that the cost of civilization, the real cost, not the textbook version, is measured in the faces of the men who died at Cannae, in the slaves who built the roads without ever being allowed to walk them freely, in the provincials who became Roman not by choice but by conquest, in the generations of soldiers who held borders they would never see the other side of and died far from anyone who remembered their names. The greatest empire in history was not built by destiny. It was built by survival, and survival is never clean. It is never just. It is never without consequence. And the question it leaves behind, the question Rome itself never fully answered, is whether what was built was worth what it cost. That question has no easy answer. But it is the right question to carry with you. Because empires end. The questions they leave behind do not. If the weight of that history settled somewhere in your chest just now, if Rome's rise feels less like triumph and more like a mirror pointed at something larger and more unsettling about human civilization, then you have felt what this story was always really about. That instinct, that need to understand what power truly costs, is exactly why this channel exists. Warpath Warriors is built for people who don't want the sanitized version of history. Who want the full weight of it. The battles, the decisions, the consequences, the echoes that reach all the way to the present day. If that is the kind of history you came here for, subscribe to Warpath Warriors right now, and hit the bell so you never miss what comes next. Because the next story is already waiting. And it is every bit as dark, as complicated, and as essential as this one.